My name is John Bergman. I come from Kahoka, Missouri. I live 5 miles south of Kahoka on a small farm. I worked in manufacturing for many, many years. I was a maintenance mechanic and just loved the job. And my talk today is based on the following books: LaSalle and the Discovery of the Great West by Francis Parkman. Francis Parkman graduated from Harvard in 1844. And he vowed that he would make it his life's work on the discovery of the Great West. And in 1870, Congress voted $10,000 for him to write this book. He was able to get the original journals of LaSalle's, and he had copies of the journals of Marquette and Joliet. Marquette and Joliet lost their journals in a canoe accident, but when they returned to civilization, they rewrote those journals, and so now we have those journals in this book. The second book that I have for my talk is A Complete History of Illinois, 1673 to 1873. The next book that I have is William Hagen's The Sauk and the Fox Indians. The talk that I'm going to give today is about the Sauk and Fox Indians from 1803 to 1813. This was a time of great change for that tribe, and it was a very terrible time for the tribe. Also, I'm using as references the letters from the officers from this area. The officers at that time in the United States Army kept a letter book. They would write a letter to a commanding officer or another officer, and the other letter they would put in their letter book. And this letter book then became property of the United States government. So now, if you want to discover history, you can go back to these letter books and find out exactly what was going on at the time. And these letters are in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I was lucky enough that I contacted a man and gave him some money so he could research these letters, and I got a copy of these letters from the different officers to each other. So that way you have a first-person account of what was taking place at the time. In 1673, Marquette and Joliet came down the Mississippi River on their great discovery expedition. When they got to the Des Moines River, they went up the Des Moines River and got to a place between Wayland and St. Francisville where there was a Native American village of 8,500 Native Americans. The first thing that you would ask yourself is, how in the world did all of these Native Americans live in this one spot? And the answer is, it was a very, very special spot. They called it the Wakanda. W-A-K-O-N-D-A. Wakanda means spirit place or spiritual place. This place, one of the boundaries was the Mississippi River, the other boundary was the Des Moines River, and then the hills alongside the Mississippi was the other boundary. This went for approximately 60 miles down the river. If you'll go to Wakanda State Park today, they spell it W-A-K-O-N-D-A. Okay, there is another Wakanda, the Wakanda River. So how come there is two Wakandas? Well, what happened when the French came here, they named everything. They named the Meskwaki Indians the Fox Indians. They had no objections to that. They didn't care what they called them. But they asked the Native Americans what the river was. And the Native Americans thought that they meant the land along the river. So they said Wakanda. Oh. And so then the Frenchmen started calling the river Wakanda. They had very big objections to that. No one called their spiritual place a river. So they told them about it. So the pronunciation is changed. You have a Wakanda, W-A-K-O-N-D-A, and you have a Wyconda, which is the river, W-Y-C-O-N-D-A. So that's why the two Waikandas. This spiritual place provided them not only everything they needed to survive, but to absolutely thrive. That many Native Americans cannot live in one place unless it is a very, very special place. Again, they thought where rivers came together, it was a spiritual place. We immediately think of Cahokia and the 20,000 Native Americans who lived there. The reason that they could live there, it was a very, very special place to them. Okay, so I've talked about the Illinois Indians, and in the 1680s, the Iroquois attacked the Illinois Indians. What they wanted to do was push them off the ground, because they wanted the ground for their own hunting purposes and trapping purposes. In a series of devastating attacks, they attacked them in 1680. The Iroquois had firearms, and they had traded with the Dutch for many, many years to get these firearms, and it was a very, very devastating attack on the Illinois tribe. They didn't completely push them off the ground, but they so weakened them that in 1720, when the Sauks attacked them, it pushed them off the ground. We know what happened to these Native Americans after that by Captain Pittman's report on him going into Illinois. He was given the assignment, he was a captain in the Royal Engineers, and he was given the assignment to go into the Illinois country and find out where the forts were, where the towns were, and where the Native Americans were, and report back on the ground. When he got to Cahokia, he found out that that was the strongest fort in North America at the time. I will not try to pronounce the name of the fort at Cahokia. It's Christez, something like that. But anyway, he also found a village of 45 houses. These houses were strung out in a line for some 3/4 of a mile long. They were French Canadians, and they had Native American wives. Part of their wives was the Cahokia tribe, and they had bought the land from the Cahokians. There were also 850 Illinois warriors there with their family. They were debauched, which means they were drunken, and they were in a very miserable state because they had been pushed off their land, and they had gone to this fort for protection from the fort. There were only 20 Frenchmen in this fort, which sounds amazing that so many warriors would go to a place to get protection from 20 Frenchmen. However, they knew that as long as they stayed near this fort, they would never be attacked by the other Native Americans around them, because if they were attacked while they were at the fort, the Frenchmen would cut off the trade to the tribes. And the Native Americans absolutely needed the trade. So now we're at 1803 and the Sauk and the Fox Indians to 1813. In 1803, something happened to the Sauk and Fox that was a terrible thing. One of their warriors, or several of their warriors, attacked a Frenchman down by St. Louis, and they killed him. And so when the Americans acquired this country, they wanted restitution for these deaths. So they sent to the Sauks and they told them that you're going to have to come to St. Louis and straighten this matter out. Well, they thought it was a matter of, they had a ceremony called the washing away of the tears, so that if they had harmed you in some way, that they would perform this ceremony of washing away of the tears, and that they would exchange presents, and they also gave up the man who had killed the Frenchman. When the Sauks and the Fox they had people that they were at war with. They were always at war with the Sioux, the Pawnee, and the Kiowa, and the Osages. But they were not at war with Frenchmen or the Americans. So since these warriors had killed these people, they were given up by the tribal council. You take them, do whatever you want to with them, and then here we will give you presents to wash away your tears, because they didn't want to go to war with the Americans. They sent 5 sub-chiefs down to negotiate this washing away of the tears. One of them was Quizmere at the village at Montrose. And when they got to St. Louis, the Americans immediately got them drunk. And after they were drunk, they had them sign a treaty. Of course, they couldn't sign the treaty, and they couldn't read the treaty because they could not read or write. But what they did do was they touched the feather to the treaty. Someone else would sign the treaty, and to signify that they had signed it, they touched the top of this feather. So they got these Native Americans drunk, and the 5 sub-chiefs, they had them at some time touch the top of a feather. By this treaty, they signed away about a quarter of the state of Missouri and Illinois, from the Illinois River clear up to the border with Wisconsin and part of Wisconsin, some 15 million acres of ground. At that time, the United States government was selling ground for about $1.25 an acre. They gave these Native Americans about $2,000 in presents for this ground. They had no idea that they were signing a treaty or that they were going to sign a treaty, because they didn't send their principal chiefs to this meeting. Normally, the tribal council and the Sauk Nation had absolutely authority, even life and death authority, over every member of the tribe. The chiefs, especially the principal chiefs, were simply figureheads. If someone would come there, they would greet them, talk to them, but they were a figurehead of the tribe. They would put them forward and they would talk. Now the war chiefs, you were a war chief only if you did great things in battle. Black Hawk, for instance, had become a warrior by the time he was 15 years old. He could command men in battle simply because he was the first to lead them in battle. But what you have to understand is they couldn't order them to do anything. In other words, he couldn't say, you 5 men go over here and you 5 men go over here. He could simply lead them in battle, and leading them meant from the front. They could not stand casualties. They did not want casualties, because these people were members of their tribe and maybe members of their group. So this was the Treaty of 1803. When the Native Americans got back to their tribe, they were very angry at them because they had brought these presents back and they thought that they had signed the treaty, which they had. The Sauk and the Fox Indians were very neat, clean Indians. Anybody that ever visited them always commented on how neat and how clean they were. Their houses were 20 foot wide and from 40 to 60 foot long. They were very well organized. Politically, they were a very strong tribe, and they were a very brave tribe. Lewis and Clark said of them that they were the finest hunters on the Mississippi River as well as the Missouri River. So that's very fine hunters indeed. So they were very good hunters, and they were a very strong people. They had villages, one at Montrose, where Quizmere, or Leaping Frog, was the chief. They had a village at the mouth of the Iowa River, but their principal village was at Sauk and Fox. At that time, in their history, there were about 6,000 Sauk Indians. There were around 1,500 Fox Indians. The Fox Indians lived from the mouth of the Rock River by Moline, East Moline, clear on up to Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin was a village of Frenchmen, French Canadians, and they had married Native American wives, and they traded with the Native Americans. By 1803, the Sauks were no longer in the Stone Age. They were in the Iron Age, the Steel Age, and the Tin Age. They were absolutely dependent on the trade from the Frenchmen. They had been trading with the French for 150 years since they had met them. So they had acquired the knives, the tomahawks, the other things that they had, and they were absolutely dependent on that trade. When the Sioux went to the French trading post at Prairie du Chien, the Fox attacked them. The Fox and the Sioux were traditional enemies. The French were very angry at this. They wanted nothing to interfere with the trade between them and the other Native Americans. So they punished the Fox, and they drove them into the arms of the Sauk Indians. The Fox Indians, or the Meskwaki, were the Red Earth people, and the Sauk Indians always called themselves the Yellow Earth people. It's very strange that they thought that they were made from the Red Earth or the Yellow Earth, and now we say ashes to ashes and dust to dust. So things happen, and their great spirit, their heavenly spirit, their beautiful spirit, depending on which Algonquin language you're talking about, was Wakanta. W-A-K-O-N-T-A-H. So Wakanda was a spiritual place, and Wakanta was their great spirit. So they worshiped Wakanta. Also, every baby that was born, their faces was either painted black or white. One of them they would paint black, the next one they would paint white. From that time on, those two sides would compete in the tribe. If they had a horse race, if they had anything that they were doing, it was always the blacks against the whites. So it made them a very, very competitive tribe. But they weren't mean about it because the other side consisted of their uncles, maybe their father, a brother. So they were very competitive, but not mean about it. So they would trade at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and the women in the summertime, they would arrive at Sauk. The women in April would start tending their gardens, and with them would be the younger children. They would take the younger children with them to tend the gardens. Now the younger boys were sent out to guard the horse herds. These were canoe Indians, and they were also horse Indians, which made them very, very mobile. They could go up the river or down the river for several miles in their canoes and hunt or fish, and then take things back to their village. And when they were at the Wakanda, they could go up the Des Moines River or up and down the Mississippi or the Fox River and hunt, and then take that back to their village. So it made them very, very mobile. So in the spring of the year, they're in Saukanack. The men in the spring of the year would go up and trade with their traders. They had had the accumulated furs of the year before, and they would trade those with the traders at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. They would come back to their village, and they would then prepare to go out on their annual buffalo hunt. Now, when they went out on their buffalo hunt, of course they would take their horses, and they also took the young men along with them. This was training for these young men to become warriors. And what a young man wanted to do in their tribe from when he was a very young man is to become a warrior. It was the only way that they could better themselves in the tribe. The principal chiefs of the tribe were hereditary. So the war chiefs were by merit. So that person had to have a lot of merit to become a war chief. So every young man wanted to be a warrior. He could become a warrior by wounding a man in battle. killing a man in battle, capturing his weapons, capturing his horse, or something like that. Then he would become a warrior. And so every young man wanted to be a warrior and studied to be a warrior. The young men would go out and tend to the horses. Yes?
This black-white thing when they're born, was that just for the males? Or
That was
it
just for
empty?
the males.
Just for the males?
Yes. That made them very competitive for the rest of their life. So they were a very competitive tribe, and they were a very strong, robust people. They would then go out on their buffalo hunt, and they would take the young men with them. Now, they would have thousands of pounds of meat that they would get out on the plains killing the buffalo. But they had to preserve that meat. To bring it back to the village, it had to be preserved. And that meant either smoking or drying it. Well, on the plains, there isn't anything to smoke the meat with, so that they would dry it. And that's why they took the young men along with them to dry the meat, so that they would have it ready for when they came back to the village. Now, this was a time of great danger for them, because their enemies, the Pawnee, the Kiowa, and the Sioux, were out on the plains, also hunting buffalo, and they were attacked by these tribes many times. And sometimes the tribes would get together and attack them as a group, because they didn't want them out on the plains hunting the buffalo. After they had prepared their meat to come back to Sauk and Fox, they would bring the meat back to Sauk and Fox, and there would be a huge celebration. They would have a feast for several days. Another feasting day that they would have is whenever the corn came in. The corn was a very important crop to them. They had over 900 acres of corn at Sauk and Fox. They had beans, they had squash, they had pumpkins. This was a very special place too. They had many, many springs of water there. They also had vast grasslands that they could have their horses on. So they would go back, have a big celebration about a successful buffalo hunt, and then after the women had hoed the corn 3 times, they would go over and work in the lead mines. Now, the women worked the lead mines. There was a lead mine at Dubuque, Iowa. And the way that they mined the lead was they'd simply dig a hole in the ground. They'd fill it with wood, put the ore on top of it, put more wood on top of that, light it on fire, and come back in 2 weeks. Their lead would be in the bottom of the hole. So they did that for many years, and the women usually did that. And any money that they made off of that, and they sold it for a nickel a pound, they would trade to the French, and they would get the pots and the pans and the other things that made their life much easier. So they did it for many years. And in 1780, Julian Dubuque came along, and he told them, if you will allow me to mine lead with you, I will bring a furnace and the other equipment that we need to start mining a lot of lead. He married an Iowa woman, and they agreed to have this joint venture mining lead with him. In 1809, they sold 48,000 pounds of lead just at the fort at Fort Madison. In 1810, it had gone up to 80,000 pounds of lead that they had sold at Fort Madison. They also sold lead to the other traders in the area. One of the traders in the area was Lewis Tesson. He was the trader at Montrose. If you'll go to Montrose today, you'll find a Tesson Street in honor of Lewis Tesson. That was their trader. There was also another trader by the name of Dennis Julian. Dennis Julian had a very big trading post at Nauvoo. He had 50 voyageurs working for him. So he would supply these men with trade goods, put it in their canoes, and they would go out into the wilderness and trade with the Native Americans for their furs, bring them back to Dennis Julian, and then he would ship them on down to St. Louis. and trade them for more trade goods. They also traded with Alexander McNabb. He was another trader in the area, and he usually traded along the Des Moines River. But at that time, you had to have a license to trade with the Native Americans. So Dennis Julian had a license to trade with the Iowa Indian, and Louis Tesson had a license to trade with the Sauk Indians. However, once they got into the wilderness, who knew who they were trading with? They brought back furs. Did they get them from the Sauks, the Sioux, the Iowa? No one knew, and it really didn't make any difference. But what it did do is every frontiersman traded with the Native Americans for the furs because it was a big money item at that time. A buckskin was worth literally $1. That's why they call it a buckskin. A deer's hide was worth $1. If you took that hide off, scraped it, and tanned it, it was worth $1. So furs were very valuable. The average person at that time made about $4 a month. So if you were a skilled laborer, you might make $6 a month. So $1 was a lot of money, and there was a lot of money in furs. But there were many ways that you could get rich on the frontier. One of them was lead, one of them was salt, and one of them was furs. The very short people would camp out on a salt lick because there was a lot of game would come to a salt lick. Also, they could take the water from these springs, boil it down, and make it into salt and make a great deal of money off of it. Nathan Boone camped on a salt lick in middle Missouri, and he had a lot of big pots and stuff that he used for salt making, and he was making $60 a month, which was a tremendous amount of money. And his workers were also making very good money. Okay, the Fox Indians, or the Meskwaki Indians, lived from the mouth of the Rock River clear up to Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. They had several villages along there. They got in a lot of trouble with the French because they had attacked the Sioux, and the French didn't want them attacking anyone who came to the forts for trading purposes. That was in 1803 where they signed this treaty. And so that the United States government had just purchased the Louisiana Purchase. They had paid $15 million for it, I believe, and they had realized a lot of money off of this treaty. What the United States government wanted to do is they wanted to transfer all the Native Americans on the western side of on the eastern side of the Mississippi across the river out west. So this was what they were trying to do and what they accomplished with this treaty. However, the Native Americans did not move off. They stayed on the land, and they vowed that no one would run them off of their land. This was 1804 now that we're talking about. This man that they took down there for the treaty to give him up to them so that they could kill him or do anything that they wanted to him. The authorities wanted to let him go. They didn't want to kill him. But the settlers in the area were adamant that they were going to kill him. So what do they do with him? At the time that these Frenchmen were killed, we didn't even own this area. You see, it belonged to France. So they were Frenchmen on French soil, killed by these Native Americans. We had no authority to do anything with them. So now what do they do with this man? Well, he was killed while trying to escape. So the Native Americans, in the fall of the year, they would come down to Wakanda. They would have a tribal council meeting, and in that tribal council, only the warriors could speak, because the warriors would protect the village, but always the women had some say in what they did. but they would vote where they would camp on the Wakanda. So they would get their canoes together, and the women and children would go in canoes down to the Wakanda, and usually in October. In October, they would catch then the fall migration of the geese, which was very important to them. The ducks and geese would migrate, and they would kill them in great numbers. They would also trap in this area. There were beaver, there were muskrat, and there were other fur bearers in the area. So they would trap these fur bearers, and then in the spring of the year, they would go into sugar camp. There were a lot of maple trees in the area, and a lot of bee trees in the area. And one of the maple sugar places was Sweet Home on the Des Moines River. There were a lot of maple trees there, and they would gather maple syrup, and they would sell that also at the fort. They would also sell a lot of feathers at the fort as part of their trade goods, besides the furs and the lead that they sold. In 1810, Julian Dubuque suddenly passed away. This was devastating to the Native Americans, because he was a great friend of theirs. So they built a monument to Julian Dubuque there at Dubuque, Iowa. And they were very saddened by his death. Well, the trader down at St. Louis, Croteau, I believe that's the right name, said that Julian Dubuque owed him a lot of money. So then he claimed the lead mines. And at St. Louis, he had an auction to sell the lead mines. The people who bought the lead mines went up the river to claim their lead mines. And the Native Americans were very upset about this and told them that, this just isn't going to happen. You're not going to take our mines away from us. You tried to take Missouri and Illinois from us, and you're not going to take part of Iowa from us. So they sent them back down the river. The Indian agent was Nicholas Bolivar, and he tried to smooth things out with the Native Americans, but it wasn't very easy because they were angry at us because of the treaty and because of many other things that we had done to them. The French, they just loved the French because the French treated them so well. The French married into their tribes. The French traded with them. The French never cheated them. The Americans come along, and the first thing we do is cheat them. They like the British. They like the British trade goods. They did not like American trade goods. In fact, they would make fun of the American trade goods. They weren't nearly as good as the British. At that time, America didn't have an industrial base. Britain did. We usually sold them the raw materials, and then they gave back to us the manufactured goods. So they always needed the services of a blacksmith because our trade goods were so terrible. So in 1808, something else happened that greatly angered the tribes against the Americans. In July of 1808, a military expedition prepared to leave St. Louis, Missouri. The head of the expedition was Colonel Hunt. Colonel Hunt was the commanding officer at St. Louis. It was a fort just above St. Louis, but I'll say at St. Louis. Well, he was a commanding officer there. He only had one company of men to go on the mission that he had for these men, and that company of men's captain, Captain Pitney, was on detached duty. So that left Alpha Kingsley in charge of this company of men. He was a first lieutenant. However, he had just been made a first lieutenant. And he was very inexperienced. He had never built a fort before, and he had never commanded a garrison before. But he had a job to do, so he was determined to do that mission. Their mission was to build a fort and trading post at the mouth of the Des Moines River. The location was extremely important because the rivers were the superhighways of the day. If you wanted to move any large amount of material, you had to move it by river. And the authorities in Washington knew that. So that's why the location of the fort was to be the Mount LeMoyne River. Suddenly, just as the expedition is starting to leave, Colonel Hunt passes away suddenly. So that left Alpha Kingsley, a very inexperienced man, in command of this expedition. The second lieutenant of this expedition was Nathan Plyer. And if you remember right, Nathan Plyer was a sergeant for the Lewis and Clark expedition. So he had the experience that Alpha Kingsley did not. There were also 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, and 3 musicians, and 59 privates along with this expedition. They headed up the river, and when they got to the mouth of the river, they decided that the locations were all too low, and they couldn't build there. So they went to Fort Madison, and they thought about building there. But the timber was so far from where they wanted the fort to be that they decided not to build it there. So they went on up to Fort Madison to build their fort. And they started construction in October of 1808. And as soon as they started construction, of course, the Native Americans would down on the Wakanda, and they found out about them building this fort up there, and they were very, very angry. And they were telling anyone who would listen that they were going to go up and destroy this fort in the spring. So it was a race. Would the men at the fort get the fort built, or would the Native Americans attack them and wipe them out? When they were building the fort, they did not have oxen to pull these logs. These logs were 14-foot long and weighed about 800 pounds apiece. So they had to have a way of pulling these logs to the fort. So they went down to Dennis Julian at Nauvoo and borrowed oxen from him. And then in that way, they started building the fort. And so in April of 1809, the Native Americans arrived at the fort. And the fort was not completed. The fort at that time did not have a front gate on it. So the Native Americans came and they traded at the trading post. And after they had done their trading at the trading post, they came over and decided they'd attack the fort. Well, the way that they could attack the fort was by coming around the edge like this and coming through the gate. But the commanding officer of the fort had pointed cannon at the gate and also had his men lined up in a circle behind the gate so that if they attacked, he would kill a lot of them. And the Native Americans decided they better not attack the fort on that day because they were ready. This fort changed many times during the construction of it. It first looked like this. Later on, they added what they called the tail. And this tail section was added on at the end of April 1809. They added that. There was a military expedition that came up the river to the rescue of the fort because they knew it was going to be attacked. But they arrived there 10 days too late. The Native Americans had left by that time. So when they got there, the commanding officer at St. Louis decided they had done a terrible thing when they had built this fort. They had built it totally in the wrong place. A fort, you have to be able to defend a fort. If you cannot defend a fort, it's absolutely useless. The fort was 25 foot from the river. It was high enough so that the river wouldn't flood it, but the bank of the river was very steep here, and that would be very costly later on when they were attacked. They also had a ridge at the top over here about 100 yards from the fort, the Native Americans could get on top of this ridge and fire down into the fort. So when you walk from one building to another in the fort, the Native Americans could fire down into the fort. So it was a very dangerous place to be. The fort at first looked like this. Then they built the trading post along beside it. It was, let's see, 20 foot wide and about 80 foot long. There were also outbuildings around the fort. Once a fort was built, all kinds of people would come to the fort for the protection of the fort. They had a stable here. John Johnson, the trader at the trading post, lived here. He had a 15 by 20 house. The interpreter, Louis Tesson, lived here. A warehouse was here, and Native Americans who came to the fort to trade would often stay in this place in inclement weather. And it was 15 by 18. Archibald McNabb had a house here. Dennis Julian had a house here. The sutler's place was here. They had a place for livestock and also an ice house. Okay, in 1809, when these people arrived at the fort, James House was the captain, and he noticed immediately that the fort had real problems. And that's when they built the tail onto the fort in order to protect it, to keep Native Americans away from this area so they couldn't fire down in the fort. There was also a spring here, 100 yards from the fort, and there was a ravine 100 yards from the fort. The Native Americans many times would get in this ravine and fire on the fort, or fire at people that came out of the fort. Also, one of the Indian attacks in 1812 came from the river. The Native Americans noticed that when the soldiers came out of the fort, they would march to this area, go through their manual of arms, and then go back into the fort. So their plan was, this was September of 1812, their plan was when they came out of the fort, they would kill them right here. They were only 25 foot away. So they would fire upon these soldiers, making sure that some of the soldiers were in the gateway. That way they couldn't close the gate. Then they would rush the gate and go in and kill the soldiers. Well, this was September the 5th, 1812. On September 5th, 1812, John Cox, one of the soldiers, decided he would go fishing. So they were often given permission to either go hunting or fishing, as long as they brought something back to the officers, it was okay. So he went down the river fishing, and a Winnebago killed him, and then the attack on the fort was on. This attack lasted for 4 days, from September 5th, 1812 to September 9th, 1812. During this attack, they burnt all the outbuildings through here, and they also slaughtered all their livestock. The men were normally given rations of beef, salt pork, or bread. They were given a pound of beef or 3/4 of a pound of pork in lieu of the beef, and a pound of bread. So these are very bad rations if you've eaten them for any length of time. They wouldn't have contained any vegetables, so they were very bad rations for any length of time. But the soldiers before 1812 and 1810, 1811, they had stocked the fort with livestock. They had ducks, geese, chickens, cattle, hogs, and they would raise these in order to support the fort, so that they could raise their own food, and they didn't depend on people bringing barges or flatboats up the Mississippi River to resupply them. Now, 100 men in a fort eat a lot of stuff, so very quickly they would eat all the rations in the fort. One of the men in 1809 that came into the fort was Dr. Simpson. Dr. Simpson was there to treat the men of the fort. And he brought a huge chest of medicines with him. And in this medicine, the most important thing that he brought to this fort was Peruvian bark. Peruvian bark, 400 years ago, there was a native in Peru that was lost in the jungle. And he was very, very ill. And I'm sorry, I've gone over the time, but he was very, very ill. And he came to a pool of water, and he drank from that pool of water, and he was cured. So he went back to his tribe, and he told them about this wonderful pool of water that he had found, and then he drank from it, and he was cured by it. So this word got back to the Jesuits that this had happened, and the Jesuits wondered, what in the world's going on? So they went over there and they looked into the subject, and they found that trees had fallen into this pool of water. And these trees were called the quinaquina trees by the Native Americans. And what had happened is the bark of these trees is what cured these people. This Peruvian bark was the bark of a quinaquina tree. And the Jesuits would take the bark of this tree, mix it with wine, and give it to people, and it would cure malaria. You see, quinaquina quinine. That's where quinine comes from. And the American Medical Association says that it was the first drug that would cure diseases, that they absolutely knew would cure diseases. And gee, I'm not partially way through what I was going to tell you, but they'd given me 45 minutes, and I just didn't watch the clock enough. But I'll wind it down a little bit. So they attacked the fort. They attacked it again in 1813. Now the Sauk and Fox denied that they were part of that attack. Black Hawk said he was over in Iowa at the time of this attack. But they attacked the fort again in July of 1813. They were building a blockhouse right here. And the Native Americans killed the 4 men that were in the blockhouse. And the attack was on. And this was an attack that never stopped. They started attacking the fort, and the people in the fort absolutely would not leave the fort because their lives were in danger every minute they were out of the fort. And of course they had to have wood to cook their rations and stuff, and to do the other things. So it was a very, very terrible time for them. On September 3rd, 1813, they left the fort. Well, in 1813, a military expedition left St. Louis. This expedition consisted of 1,300 men, and they went up the Illinois River to Peoria, Illinois, and there they built Fort Clark. And when they built Fort Clark, they sent Nathan Boone and his rifle rangers up the river to look at Saukanock. Now they were still some miles from Saukanock, but the problem was Black Hawk and his warriors had left to attack the Americans in another place. So they were short about 250 warriors. Now the Americans had taken part of the Sauk, and they had convinced them to camp down along the Missouri River so that they could be away from the fighting, and they knew that they weren't enemies. So most of the warriors were gone, and so that left very few warriors left at Saukanock. Well, the tribal council met, and the tribal council voted that they would go across the river into Iowa. Now, this would have been a terrible time for them, because in the middle of October, they're crossing a river with their canoes, and they have to set up another camp over in Iowa. So it would have been a starving time for them, a terrible time for them. When one young man stepped forward and said, why don't you let me and a few other warriors stay here, and we will protect our homes and protect the burial sites of our grandfathers. So they had another council meeting, and they decided that they would stay. And that young man was Chief Gilcook. And so that concludes my program, and I'm sorry that I run a little bit over, but I get to talking about history, and I just don't want to stop.
Sure.
We do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, this history is just vitally important.
Yeah.
You know,
But I hope you took away from this the importance of the Wakandoa. It was a very, very important place to the Native American. It was a spiritual place. It was a special place. It was the Wakanda, which means spiritual place. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.